For most of the 20th century, whales were a consumer good. Not in some abstract way, but very literally. Whale oil was rendered down into margarine and cooking fat, into soap, into the coating on pills and the lubricant and delicate machinery. An animal the size of a bus was turned into the most ordinary stuff imaginable on an industrial scale all over the world. And after World War II, the country that hunted more whales than any other wasn't Japan or Norway, but the Soviet Union. For about 400 years, Russia was actually pretty bad at whaling. Russia has a huge Arctic coastline, wrapping around the top of the world, reaching from the Barents Sea to the North Pacific. The catch, so to speak, was that Russia lacked the maritime industry and infrastructure to support whaling on a major scale. Dutch, British, and later Norwegian and American whalers sailed to Russian shores, caught whales, while Russians themselves could do little besides watch. The first person who made a serious attempt at changing this situation was Peter the Great. His dream was to turn Russia into a major naval power, and to him, that came with a serious whaling industry. There was also an important economic motivation. Russia had few products that the rest of the world wanted to buy, but whale oil could be sold in Europe for very high prices. It was a potential way to turn stretches of mostly useless Arctic coast into cash. Russia tried importing foreign whalers, primarily from the Netherlands, to teach them how to do it. Dutch whalers had very little reason to leave, though, so most of the ones that went to Russia were the dregs. A company staffed with German specialists that the government contracted only caught 2 whales. The Russian government eventually got so fed up with this that they concluded these foreigners were deliberately sabotaging them and mostly gave up on the whaling effort by the end of the 1700s. While this venture was faltering, however, Russia was busy expanding eastward. Russia pushed across Siberia until they hit the northern Pacific Ocean. Waiting out here, in the Sea of Okhotsk, was some of the best waters for whaling in the entire world. Still though, it wasn't Russian sailors pulling whales from the water. By the 1850s, the sea was teeming with American sailors, hundreds of ships killing every kind of whale and stopping on the shore to trade guns with the native Koryak and Tungus people. While the Russian government loudly asserted their claims to these waters, there was little they could actually do about it, since Russia still couldn't patrol its own coastline. The one partial exception Russia had was a Finnish adventurer named Otto Lindholm, who set up the first real Russian whaling operation in the Pacific in the 1860s. Though, calling this operation Russian is still a stretch, since he mostly operated an international crew for his own profit. His one lasting legacy was where he chose to retire, a brand new Pacific port called Vladivostok, which decades later would become the capital of Soviet whaling. So that's where Russia stood at the turn of the 20th century, some of the best waters for hunting cetaceans in the world, but no true industry of their own. But then, in 1917, the Bolsheviks took over, and they were sure they could do what 4 centuries of czars couldn't. Their whole view was that science and central planning could solve anything, including what the old empire had failed at. Ironically, the new Soviet government thought they could both master nature and be kinder to it than the capitalists of the world. A scientist from the Moscow Fisheries Institute summed it up by saying they would protect whales from the predatory extermination by the capitalist countries. The Soviet Union would instead push whales to the brink of extinction. The Soviet Union got its first ships resembling a true whaling fleet in the 1930s. The centerpiece was a factory ship named the Alyut. It's worth explaining briefly how exactly a whaling fleet works. The catcher boats, small, fast, with a harpoon gun mounted on the bow, did the hunting, chasing whales down and killing them. The factory ship did everything after. Where previous whalers had to drag their catch back to the shore or strip it alongside the boat in the water, the factory ship hauled the whole whale aboard and rendered it down into oil, meat, and bone meal right there at sea. That cut out land entirely, letting a fleet stay out for months and hunt anywhere on Earth. On the Alyut, the piece that made it possible was the stern slipway, a ramp in the back of the ship that winched an entire whale onto the deck. It also, conveniently, hid most of the killing from anyone watching. The Aleute's fleet killed its first whale on October 25, 1932, the 15th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. It worked the North Pacific through the 30s, hunting every type of whale: fins, humpbacks, grays, sperm whales, even the rare North Pacific right whale. The fleet hit its targets and became something of a national symbol. The most celebrated was the Aleute's own captain, Alexander Dudnik, who in 1936 was awarded the Order of Lenin, the country's highest honor. 2 years later, he was arrested. On the eve of a 1938 voyage, the NKVD took him from his cabin and charged him with spying for Japan and scheming to sell the Aleut to a Japanese firm. He was released from prison after 18 months, though, and lived until 1973. World War II was, briefly, probably the best thing that ever happened for whales. The big factory ships were slow and made easy targets, and a lot of them ended up on the seafloor. By 1945, every Japanese factory ship had been sunk. Of the world's 43 floating factories, only 16 survived. For a few years, much of the ocean went quiet. The Aleut was the biggest exception, however. It worked the North Pacific straight through the war, and actually had its best years ever in 1942 and 1943, finishing off most of the remaining gray whales in the Western Pacific while it supplied the Red Army with whale products. When the war ended, though, many countries faced shortages of various products, including edible fats. Whale oil was one of the cheapest sources available, and many countries rushed back into the whaling industry. Britain restarted Antarctic whaling barely 2 months after the fighting stopped, and the US even helped Japan return to the hunt to feed its people. For the Soviet Union, there was both a need and an opportunity. It had come out of the war as one of the two most powerful countries on Earth, but also quite poor and lacking much food. The war and German occupation had wrecked the country's best agricultural lands, and real wages had fallen by half. The Soviet Union really needed to jump on the cheap whale oil train, and their current 1% share of the global catch wasn't going to cut it. As Anastas Mikoyan, Stalin's man in charge of trade and the food supply, had been telling him since 1933, the country needs the fats. The ship at the center of the expansion was a former German factory ship called the Wikinger, claimed as war reparations, which the Soviets renamed the Slava. In December 1946, it sailed from Liverpool for the Antarctic, crewed largely by veterans who had been injured during the war. They didn't know the Antarctic, so they brought along Norwegian specialists to find and harpoon the whales for them. The Southern Ocean held far more whales than the North Pacific, and bigger ones, including blue whales, which the Soviets rarely hunted before. The ones down here were also quite easy to catch. The Norwegian gunners killed faster than the inexperienced Soviet crew could process the bodies, and dead whales started piling up on deck. At one point, the officers had to stop the hunt because there were more carcasses than there was room to cut them up. The rest were tied to the stern to wait, and many rotted before anyone could get to them. Most of the crew didn't know how to butcher a whale, and at one point even the bookkeepers were sent down to help strip blubber. From the very first season, the Soviets were killing more whales than they could use. The factory ship let them kill on an industrial scale, but they didn't yet have the skill or the organization to process everything they caught. By 1949, however, the Soviets felt ready to truly strike out on their own, and got rid of their Norwegian help. This decision was quickly proven right, and in the 1949 to 1950 season, the Slava outcaught almost all foreign ships of similar size. The Slava's captain, Alexei Solyanik, became something of a celebrity as a result. Solyanik had come from almost nothing, working on sardine boats in the Russian Far East, and now commanded what was perhaps the most famous ship in the Soviet Union. He wrote books, appeared on magazine covers, and turned the Slava's foreign port calls into ad hoc goodwill tours. He also used these visits to sell the Soviet Union as a responsible, conservation-minded whaler. At a 1958 dinner in Wellington, he told the room that Antarctic whale stocks were in serious trouble and that he personally wanted the International Whaling Commission to set stricter quotas, at a moment when his own fleet was one of the main reasons these stocks were in trouble. This was before Gagarin and the cosmonauts in general, so he ended up partially filling the role of a hero the Soviet Union could publicly show off. He was, by most accounts, a skilled mariner. He fit the Khrushchev era well, as a communist who believed in socialism but also building a personal fortune to some extent, and who reliably delivered the production numbers the state wanted. He was also, as the Fisheries Ministry noted as early as 1950, prone to violation of financial discipline. His success was in part fabricated, however. To understand why, we have to look at the International Whaling Commission itself. Founded in 1946, the IWC was meant to be the global regulator for the industry, with its member nations agreeing on hunting limits, guided by scientific advice so whalers didn't hunt any species to extinction. It lacked a true enforcement mechanism, however. The system simply hoped every country reported their catch accurately. The Soviet Union began lying almost immediately and filing fake numbers with the IWC. Interestingly, they initially started by overstating their catch for the 1949 to 1950 season. 69 fin whales caught in reality became 718 in their report, and 97 sperm whales became 173. This was an attempt to exploit the IWC's quota system. A country's share of the yearly quota was based partially on how much it had caught previously. By inflating their numbers, the USSR could claim a bigger share later. From the Soviet perspective, this wasn't cheating exactly. This was merely them finally receiving their fair share. They'd started late. Norwegian, British, and American fleets had already killed plenty of whales, so a few thousand more hardly mattered to the Soviets. Any whale they passed up would just be killed by some capitalist anyway. By the late 1950s, however, the lie had flipped, and the Soviet whaling fleet was now underreporting its catch instead. The Soviets had completely blown past their quotas, and were hunting protected species and operating in waters forbidden for whaling. Why this was happening was due to how Soviet central planners had made incentives for whalers. Everything in the Soviet Union ran on a top-down plan, with enterprises given goals from above they were expected to hit. Whaling fits this very neatly, better than a lot of Soviet industries did, since whales are easy to count. Targets were set in terms of whales caught and tons of oil produced, with incentives that strongly encouraged crews to exceed their internationally agreed-upon quotas. A whaler earned a 25% bonus for meeting his quota, and a 60% bonus for exceeding it by more than a fifth. Soviet whalers called this the long ruble, the money you could make by taking a difficult, faraway job. Between the high wages and the bonuses, a whaler made far more than an ordinary worker back home. The objective on every ship became something very simple: kill as many whales as you possibly can. The overhunting problem only became worse with how the quotas were decided. The Fisheries Ministry set next year's target based on this year's catch, so if a fleet wildly overshot and reported the whole haul, its target next year would jump and the bonuses would become harder to hit. The smart move was to exceed the plan, but only by a little on the official reports, and hide the rest. This system pushed the fleets to catch more and more, while reporting less and less. There was also little regard for if the whole operation actually made any financial sense, which made Soviet whaling especially dangerous towards whale populations. As a species is hunted towards collapse, the survivors become harder to find. You have to spend more fuel and labor to find and catch each one, so the cost keeps rising. Meanwhile, whale oil was already being undercut by cheaper substitutes like vegetable oil. Sooner or later, it simply isn't economically viable to keep hunting. That rising cost is, in a strange way, a form of protection. It tends to make the rarest animals the least worth pursuing, which can give a battered population room to recover. The Soviet system stripped that protection away. The fleets were judged on whether they hit their numbers, so the fleets kept hunting at full speed even as the whales grew scarcer and more vulnerable. And since the numbers were being faked, nobody knew that this was happening, and to what extent. The true numbers are staggering. In one stretch of Antarctic waters, south of Australia and New Zealand, lay a patch of water designated by the IWC as Area 5 on the migration route of the southern humpback. In November 1959, Solyanik took the Slava and the new Sovetskaya Ukraina factory ship into it. By the time the season was over, they had killed over 11,000 humpbacks in Area 5, and over 1,100 in the nearby Area 6, which had been designated a whale sanctuary. The Sovetskaya Ukraina alone accounted for more than 7,000 of these killed whales, beating its production plan by 53%. When the Soviet fleet reported its catch for the season to the IWC, they only officially logged 720 whales. The same thing happened the next season, over 9,000 humpbacks killed, but only 302 officially reported. Because the IWC trusted these numbers, its scientists believed the humpback population was holding steady, when in reality they were at the brink of extinction. The catch at New Zealand's shore stations fell from 361 whales in 1960 to 80 in 1961 to 32 in 1962. In 2 seasons, the Soviets had destroyed the humpback population of an entire ocean, and the organization meant to prevent exactly that had no idea it was happening. Big picture, the scale of this is hard to comprehend. Over the 20th century, humans killed close to 3 million whales, what one NOAA scientist called the largest removal of biomass in world history. The Soviet Union accounted for more than 500,000 of them, the most in the period following World War II. By raw count for the century, though, they weren't even the worst. Norway killed close to 800,000, Japan around 600,000, but the raw count badly underestimates the harm they did. 2 things made Soviet whaling especially destructive. First, they aimed at the whales that were supposed to be safe. They hunted in closed waters and IWC sanctuaries, and they killed protected, already collapsing species. These included right whales, off-limits since 1931, and the Area 5 humpbacks they wiped out. Killing 11,000 of an endangered, protected species does far more damage than killing 11,000 of a common one. Second, because of how severely they faked their numbers, it corrupted the data and threw off the whole system. The IWC set everyone's limits from reported catches, so with the Soviet figures poisoned, the whole world's pictures of whale populations was wrong. Stocks looked healthier than they were, limits stayed too high, and the true scale of the collapse stayed hidden for decades. All told, the Soviets killed around 170,000 more whales than they ever reported. So, how did anyone actually find out about this and the true scale of it all? Soviet whaling fleets carried biologists who studied the whales even as the fleets were hunting them. These were people who, more than almost anyone else alive, understood exactly what was being lost. Some of them secretly kept honest records of the real catch, at real personal risk. One biologist, Dmitry Tormosov, hid the true records in his potato cellar. When the Soviet Union collapsed, these scientists brought forth the real numbers, and essentially forced the world to rewrite the entire modern history of whaling. There was opposition to Soviet whaling in its time, too. In June 1975, off the coast of California, a handful of activists from Greenpeace confronted a Soviet factory ship, the Dalny Vostok. Protesters on small inflatable boats put themselves between the ship and a fleeing pod of sperm whales, and dared the ship's crew to fire their harpoons at them. They also brought cameras with them, and filmed the entire clash. Greenpeace's leader, Bob Hunter, designed the scene precisely: a few unarmed people and a group of whales against a huge factory ship. The footage went around the world, and helped turn Save the Whales into one of the defining causes of the era. The pressure against whaling only built through the rest of the decade. In 1982, after years of public campaigns, the IWC finally voted to ban commercial whaling entirely, with the ban set to take effect after the 1985 to 1986 season. Here we get to yet another systemic failing of the IWC. Under its own rules, any member state could file an objection within 90 days of a change like this, and simply not be bound by the decision. Japan, Norway, Peru, and the Soviet Union all lodged objections, which left them legally free to keep whaling. The arguments from these countries weren't out of stubbornness or malice, though. They pointed out correctly that the IWC's own scientific committee had never recommended a blanket ban. The moratorium was a political decision, driven by a wave of new anti-whaling member states and public pressure campaigns, not a conclusion the science had reached. The Soviet commissioner specifically had complained it was being driven by emotion rather than data, which is pretty rich, of course. The country complaining that the IWC lacked good data was the same one whose lies had wrecked that data in the first place. What finally ended Soviet whaling was actually their fishing fleet. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union ran an enormous commercial fishing fleet, worth far more to the country than whaling ever had been. Much of the world's best fishing now lay inside the 200-mile zones that coastal nations had claimed off their shores, including the United States. So the Americans made the Soviets an offer: give up whaling or lose access to US fishing waters. In 1985, the Soviet Commissioner announced the USSR would wind down Antarctic whaling, and by 1987, after more than half a century, Soviet commercial whaling came to an end. In the end, the whales outlasted the system that hunted them. Once the killing stopped, many of the populations the Soviets had pushed towards collapse began, slowly, to recover. The humpbacks of the Southern Ocean, including the ones nearly wiped out in Area 5, have come back in the tens of thousands. Others are still climbing, though a few, like the blue whales, may never fully recover. The Soviet Union set out to prove that a planned, scientific economy could do industry without wrecking nature as capitalism did. Instead, it killed protected whales in secret by the tens of thousands and lied about it for decades. The whales came back, the Soviet Union has not.
Набранный номер в настоящее время никому не принадлежит. Проверьте правильность набора номера.